in here. I would have cut it off anyway. So what am I doing? I'm going to GitHub. Yeah. Go. Am I still sharing?
Yeah.
Or did it turn off?
No, she's still sharing.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so back to V4. So that's all that was used here. So, if we look at the AK sequencer engine, which I guess is the heart of it. Actually, I wish Matt Howell were here, because he actually thinks that some of that drift could be fixed by his latest PR. I don't know if you saw what he's been doing, but I'm just trying to see here first if there's anything that's very different from what we're doing, how we're doing it now. I can open them up side by side as well, or at least. Probably see AudioKit. I mean, like, if we look at, for instance, the process block, I remember seeing this in last week's Matt Howell's presentation, where all the stuff was being used. So I don't think this is any different here. Am I looking in the wrong place here? AK sequencer engine. Okay. So these actually do look quite a bit different. What am I missing here? I'm gonna have to follow this from the top down, since there is a significant difference here. I'm wondering what why it is. So this is the older. This block, it just has an internal processing with events, and it looks like it's basically just relying on MIDI to work, whereas the new one has all this process stuff. And I don't know if that's just because two things got merged or what. I'm kind of lost. Well, clearly I need to dive into this and do some serious, because this is where, so yeah, actually, you know what I said at the beginning was very wrong. I said I didn't think they were much different. They're different. It could be that they could be trivially different because it looks like this is doing most of its work inside of a DSP kernel, whereas all that DSP kernel stuff got moved into the regular file, just into the struct there. But it's still different enough that there's plenty of reasons why one would work and one would be somehow messed up. But we have at least like a pretty distinct difference between these two. I should be able to do some tests and figure out where the problem happened. I don't think I'm going to be able to figure it out in this in this time frame for the office hours, as people love to see this video of me saying duh. I guess that's also part of office hours, just to get me to actually take these problems seriously, because you guys kind of have me.
Put you on the spot, man.
Yeah, put me on the spot. Say, hey, Ari, really, really take a look at this. Don't just assume that it's the same. I mean, since Brian's the only one that showed up, I guess he wins the right to put me through this out. It's okay. I need to fix this. It's he's provided ample evidence that it has stopped working the way it used to. So let's go back up. Let's go to top here. So we know that Hey Metronome used AK sequencer track. And the sequencer track is an AK node. Again, it got connected in the conductor. I'll show that here on Xcode. Pull this window back up, right? So AK sequencer track is here. And when what else do we do to this thing? Conductor. So this is the actual connecting together of the signal chain for Hey Metronome. And our wavetable is getting connected, and then our tracks are set up as sequencer tracks here and here. And then our tracks all get connected to the signal chain. And that was kind of the way we did in AK4. But if we pull up like shaker metronome from the cookbook, that's a salt shaker. Yeah. We're using the sequencer. And the sequencer as far as I know, it doesn't really get connected to anything, right? It's just kind of magical. It's running, and the things that it sequences, like the shaker, that has to be in the signal chain. But the sequencer tracks themselves are not explicitly added to the signal chain. It's a pretty different way of working from AK4, where AK4, the tracks themselves were kind of like nodes. And it could be why they were working, because they were actually getting data pulled through them at the right speed, and then this is doing something else to get the sequences to trigger.
Look
Right.
who's here.
Hey, Matt.
Hey guys, thanks for letting
Matt,
me join.
were your ears burning? Because we were just talking about you. In a good way. Oh, he froze.
The shaker.
Oh, is it my
Yeah,
internet?
so let me summarize it, because it was kind of an interesting journey here. Oh, am I coming through?
Maybe it's me. My
You guys hear me?
I hear you. Yeah,
Okay.
I hear you. I think I'm here. If you guys can hear me, but I hear
Yeah,
I hear all of you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think only Marcus is having troubles. Okay, so what we started doing this office hours is Brian on general, as you probably have seen, he has posted videos of different metronome drifts happening.
Sweet.
And
yeah, saw those.
he has pointed out and reiterated in this call that the AudioKit 4 based metronome app like Hey Metronome and commercial apps, they don't drift. And the AudioKit 5 shaker based metronome does drift. And at first I was
Did we lose Ari?
Oh, I saw. Yeah, I think it's some frozen.
yeah,
Freezing.
yeah. I couldn't tell if it was me or him, but I think it might be him. I turned off my video and started doing a speed test just to see. We lost Ari, man. He's frozen.
Oh, come back.
Come back. All right, here. Let me see if he's slack-a-lacking.
Okay, we'll come back maybe.
While we're waiting, oh yeah, it looks like he left. He'll rejoin in a second, I guess. How you doing, Matt?
Pretty good, pretty good. Yeah, I was like in my car doing some car stereo maintenance stuff, so I was like, oh, it's time. I gotta go.
Do you mean like playing your music in the car to test the mix, or something else?
Just hanging out in my car, just like, yeah. No, I have a Android head unit or whatever, so I was like, what's the deal? Because I want to upgrade the operating system and blah blah blah.
Here he is.
Being a
Ari's
total nerd.
back.
Cool.
I like that about you, Matt. Don't change. All right, Ari's back. We have you.
Yay. Welcome
hopefully
back.
that was temporary. I don't know. Sometimes
Yeah.
my internet isn't great.
Yeah.
Dude, turn off your Bitcoin mining operation.
Yeah.
That Monero going through the pipes.
I don't know anything about Bitcoin. I feel so strange about everyone that's so obsessed with this stuff, but
Next
I have
office
no
hours.
idea about it. Yeah.
We'll talk.
To the moon. Yeah.
Oh, that's what we could do. Mars. Talk about Mars. Anyways, back to the sequencer.
Yeah, I don't know
Focus.
anything.
Focus.
I know two things. I know biking and I know audio. If I'm telling one of those two things, screw it. All right. So anyway, basically trying to see what are the main differences and why one is causing drift. And the big thing I'm seeing now, which I must have realized, but now is kind of feeling new to me, is that in the past we had to actually, where is this? Like I'll pull up the Hey Metronome code again. This is AudioKit 4 code, and we actually had to add tracks of sequencers as nodes into the signal chain, where that now is taken care of or is done some different way. And I'm thinking that could possibly be the cause of this drift issue, because when I did it like this, I was guaranteed that we're pulling data through the sequencer exactly at the same rate as we were doing other things, right? So this to me feels like both should work, but this to me feels like more explicitly tying the sequencer speed to the way the audio engine is pulling the data through. So do you have anything to add on that front? Chime in, otherwise I'm going to continue. pushing through.
So I don't know exactly. I haven't looked at the sequencer stuff on 4 yet, but on 5, the sequencer. So there's kind of this specific thing, which is like the sequencer itself is usually you make a sequencer, it has a track, like at least one track, and the track, when you add things to the sequence, right? Like the note sequence, I think is what it's called. It's like a data structure, and that data structure has all the note information that when you add notes or remove notes or clear the sequence, the track itself updates the AU render observer function, which is like called before and I think after or whatever, but it's definitely called before the internal render block, right? So that's sort of like called before, and it's called in order for you to get the real-time event update, like real-time. You get a reference to the head of this set of events in the internal render block, and that internal render block is the thing that's like sort of guaranteed to be called in time for your block rate and your sample rate on the real-time thread. But I'm not really sure that the AU render observer stuff like has any real time guarantees. I think it only has like ordering guarantees. Like it'll happen before, but I'm not sure that. And then in that process, like the shaker, anything in version 5 is going to have an understanding of its own position in time based on the accumulation of samples processed by the AU render observer. And at no point in version 5 do we actually look at like wall time, like or wall clock time. And so what we're doing is we're just like, whenever that function gets called, we count the frames. And then given the count of those frames, we return the position, right? So we don't have any drift or wall clock compensation, right? So like however, whenever that happens, we're just sort of like, oh, we're on, okay, how many frames have we already processed at some point, and how many will we do this time? So there's sort of like, and I wonder if version 4 has something like that, or if version 4 does all of the scheduling or all of the note triggering inside the internal render block, then that would probably be more likely, it's going to be closer to sample accuracy, just for the fact that it's like happening in that place. So that's kind of where I was considering like this might be the thing there. So
right. Well, I mean, this is the AudioKit 4 sequencer DSP kernel, and that's where the process block was happening, and all of this complicated stuff that we talked about last week is included. But that stuff still is here.
But it's so that last one you showed, that's a DSP kernel. That's an internal render block, not an AU observer, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm kind of wondering, like, is there a difference there? And then definitely there's no real tracking of the wall clock. So it's like, I feel like the internal, it's just weird. Like I ran a thing where I was like checking. One thing you can do to check essentially is like in the version 4, you can print out the time that it is now, like the current time compared to the current time of the last buffer starting, right? So you can say like, okay, what's the difference between the current time at which time this callback was called, and that's going to like waver a little bit. And then I'm guessing that the AU render observer is going to waver more than the internal render block call, if that makes sense. Because it's just going to be, it's like the guarantees for these things is like AU or the internal render block is, I think, guaranteed more. It's more likely to be guaranteed anyway, sort of definitely before the clock, the actual wall clock time that the next audio sample is supposed to be processed. It's going to happen definitely before. Whereas I don't know if the render observer function is really considered to be like a real-time function call as much as it's like you put this in place so that we can use this in order to get, the events in place. So it's like, it's
gotcha.
So I don't know.
So we did, so with our process block in AudioKit 4 version, that one takes the traditional frame count and the offset, and then it's doing all of its logic. And then AudioKit 5 instead, and this is something you've actually updated in your pull request to be, because now we have this process block, which doesn't actually it just has the frame count in there. It doesn't have anything about buffer offsets or anything.
Right.
Presumably that's now handled because you're in this render observer block or something.
Right. So what's
And
buffer offset in the DSP kernel? Just to refresh, like that sets the audio. There's like a frame count, and then there's a buffer offset. Buffer offset's like, what does that represent? Because I'm not sure we have something like that in the
well, let's see
in
if I
render
were even
observer.
using it to start off.
No,
It
okay.
doesn't actually matter because we're not using it.
Right.
So for whatever it's representing, it's
Yeah.
not the source of the fix in terms of like what's going on inside of AudioKit 4.
Right.
So all we're getting is this frame count. I guess I still really got to understand how this is, like, what the benefit was. So where do you think where is the actual like connecting to the engine? And you said it was when you add and
Right.
subtract notes.
Yeah. So yeah. So if you look at like, let's see, sequence. There's sequence. I think we should start there. Like, let's for ease of use. So sequence. There's sequencer, track, and there's sequencer. Right. And that's all the Swift code in
Yeah.
in version 5. And in version 4 is pretty close, except we can see the difference really is just that we're calling the for lack of a better term, it's like the scheduling code, which is the code that just says, make sure we schedule these notes before the time that they're supposed to be playing. And what that, it calls this thing called the MIDI block, and the MIDI block kind of tells the system like, hey, these are the events that we need to get scheduled. And then that MIDI block, when the system calls it, sort of grabs that stuff and then feeds it to the DSP kernel on the internal. I know this is really fucking, this is like an expensive,
let's go
mind computation
from the top level down. Like,
okay,
so the highest thing is the sequencer. That's the most generic, right? In AudioKit 5, and it has tracks in it. It's very set up like a DAW, really. You've got a sequencer, it has tracks, and the tracks themselves have sequences inside of them. So that's the order we'll look down at them.
And a track has a sequence. Just did that we just said tracks have sequences inside.
Exactly. So the sequencer is kind of like the DAW. The DAW has a tempo, it has a length. It's very, if you can think of them in terms of Logic or Ableton, I think this makes sense. These are the types of things you would see on the DAW interface, whether it's playing or not. And
another key piece of it is the sequencer settings data structure, and that gets passed to, I believe, a track, but that's another piece of it too. So I think it's in, I can also, I have some stuff up in mine. That's sort of like,
okay, well, let's go.
Anyway,
slowly.
but that's an important piece. Go ahead. That just has the tempo and, different things like.
So here's like where you add note numbers to it, and all that's doing is saying for the track in question, and grab a sequence and add the note numbers to that sequence. So it's kind of a helper function. To bring. So
this is the sequencer adding a note to its tracks sequence, right? Yeah. So the data itself is in the sequence inside the track, and the sequencer has the track.
Right. So I see nothing in this file as of yet that's doing anything about connecting the tracks to the engine. This is
so then when the track, so if you look at the track calls update sequence, and that's the place where the render observer gets created and hooked in. That's kind of
so like a track makes, again, to make it feel like the DAW, like the track has a target, which kind of feels like a DAW too. You have like a virtual instrument on your target.
And the target is the thing whose DSP kernel is actually the one whose internal render block is, it's sort of like you have the internal render block and then you have its observers. So the observers are called before the internal render block. So the DSP kernel in this situation is going to be that node's internal render block.
And we can sort of see how it's removing itself first before we see how it's adding itself, like it's saying.
Yeah. It's like in order for us to attach this sort of like observer or callback to the node's internal render block, which is to say its DSP kernel, we get that token, right? And then and it's similar for like how we check out parameters, I think. And so
Well,
Yeah,
here
so
it
like
is. Here's the
this
update
update will
sequence.
do that. Yeah, it'll do that. It'll say like, is there a is there already like a render observer in place for this audio unit, which is the target? And then if there is, we remove it, we give it the token and we say, get rid of that render observer. And then we get a new token. Here's the, here's the data that we want to pass to the observer function, which is the events and the notes and the settings, and then the MIDI block, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of, and so that means, okay, now that's attached to this node's internal render, function. That's kind of what that does.
Okay. Thing on the audio branch.
Okay.
I don't believe there's anything like that, because I think we're actually just basically just
Right.
treating these things as nodes themselves. And then we send MIDI data around, but we're not actually
Is this the for code?
This is 4 on the left. Yeah, this tab here on the left is the the AudioKit 4. So yeah, it's quite a bit different. Clearly,
well,
somebody
we're still
didn't
passing
reinvent
the
this.
events in the node. So somewhere, even if we're not passing it necessarily into the render block, it's going to have access to it. So like the DSP kernel is accessing notes and sequence events, which are essentially, just all MIDI events. And then so in the for code, how does it get access to that? So if it's a DSP kernel here, right? So I'm guessing that's like C++ world, and it has access to, like, we have notes. Like, where does it get access to that notes on like 174? We get into notes, and so like, oh, in this case, notes might be playing.
This is the local variable.
Okay, interesting. Well, is it okay? So then, so we have
where it's defined here, but
Oh yeah, it's like, instead of the track holding a sequence which holds the data, for the DSP kernel code holds that note data. So it's like, it's accessible to that. Okay.
Yeah. So, and then it just seems to, where does it actually play the notes? It sends the MIDI data. This is where it actually does the work to actually send the data through. And so
for version 4, we're going to query the DSP kernel date. Like, basically, we're going to query that class for the position, right? Which is going to be tied essentially to, we say, this is the beat position. Okay, real-time render function gets called. Now we have an updated number of frames that have passed in time. And so here's the new position on the next render call. We're going to say, okay, this many frames passed since last time. And this is like the real-time function. So that makes sense that, like, if we track the number of frames and it's a real-time guarantee function, we're going to be getting like sets of frames that are, this set of frames started at a time when, it gets complicated because when the render function gets called, you're being fed a timestamp. Essentially, you're saying, like, here's the time that your buffer will begin at, right? So when you say, okay, I need to generate audio for this next buffer, you have to know, like, what time is that at, that I'm generating the audio for. And in this case, we're generating MIDI for that time period.
Right.
So
yeah. So it's looking at sequence real quick to see if this just seems to be managing the MIDI data. There's no render observer calls or anything here. This is just the actual notes, the MIDI data that's kind of inside of these things. So I think that's not part of the key here. So the Swift side makes sense to me. The big difference here on the Swift side is this update sequence, as you said at the beginning. So that's what's getting the data down into the DSP level that it can interact with.
All of the beats, right? Like, the whole sequence is just passed into that observer. And so, if you had a sequencer, for instance, that held like thousands and thousands of notes, that would be a lot to process in that real-time thing. But if you go to that process function, you'll see, like, the general things that happens inside the process function is that we look through the whole set of nodes, which is the whole sequence. And we either send MIDI data or we don't send MIDI data, right? Simple. And then, so that's kind of like, okay, everything that's not during the time period for this buffer, we ignore that, and everything for the time period that this buffer represents, we send that. That's kind of what the process function in this file right here does in the sequencer engine. So that process in version 5 is that render observer, and that process, like, the first thing it does, if you want to go through it, is like, I think, what is it? Yeah, it's a little further down the process function itself, but the first thing it does is process events, and that's like sequencer related events, not like MIDI notes. Like that just says, should I stop all the notes or should I seek to a new position?
It's above here, right?
Yeah.
Precedence here. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's like, stop all notes. Currently, all we have is like stop all notes and seek to a different position. Yeah. And then the next line on 122 is like, if we're playing, then do something. If you're not playing, you don't do anything at all. And, or, this process just keeps running and it doesn't do anything. So then if it is running, it just checks like, are we looping? And if we're looping and we're past like the length of the sample, it just checks that we don't keep like processing this stuff if we're not looping and we've gone beyond the beat time. And then, so what it does, it grabs a current sample. Position modulo is basically like saying, what sample number are we on? And it like modulos the loop time. So it gets a beat time, in terms of a loop, and then it turns that into samples. And that's what the current start sample, current end sample does. The next loop that we see here goes through events that aren't notes. Sure. And that's pretty straightforward. That just grabs them all. And there's two things that happen in each of these loops. Like one is it looks for things that happen in the current loop that have to be scheduled in the current buffer. And then the second part of it, the else if, it goes through things that are in the next loop that are in the current buffer. So you have this concept of like when a buffer overlaps where the loop stops and the loop starts, we have to do this sort of special stuff. And this is done really well, actually. It's awesome. Like that code I feel like has been strong. And then the last thing I did was actually switch them around, but that's other than that. So then the second piece, as it says, it looks for scheduled notes on, and it looks for, offs that are in the now playing notes. So there's kind of two structures here. One is like, out of all notes, look for the note ons. The next one is like, amongst the notes that are playing, look for the ones that have to be shut off.
And I think we discussed this in enough detail last time about the note ons and not offs. But what's still
that's
happening,
all aside from the point, I think. Yeah.
Like that stuff is, if we're going to be looking now to see what might be causing drift, I mean, if Brian had discovered flutter inside, they were staying in beat, but there's like a chorusing that happened that he would hear, then we would be looking here to say, okay, well, maybe we have some internal, like within each one sequence, there's some kind of imprecision. But this is something I think is getting compounded. It doesn't, from looking at the video, one of the first videos I looked at more carefully was his thing just got progressively worse, and there were moments where it was getting to an interesting little rhythm and stuff, but it was never like going back. It wasn't like now it's slowing up and speeding up. It was continuously going in one direction. Isn't that right,
and it was consistent, right? It was consistently playing the sequence as it should be played. It just wasn't. It just keeps getting shifted into the future in terms of where you would,
think so,
like if you calculated,
Actually, the one thing that was interesting I noticed today was that when I compared the shaker metronome against tempo, which behaved the same on both my iPads, it wasn't like they were getting slower. The one iPad was actually getting faster than tempo, which was a little strange. It wasn't delaying, it was speeding up.
Right. Okay.
That's good to know too, actually, because that could be give us an idea what to look for. Because if it's speeding up, that's a little bit even more mysterious. Like you'd expect things to go wrong to be kind of taking more time a little bit or something.
That's just a casual observation. It's, once again, this is all just rough no measurements at all, just rough observations. So
sure.
So the frames counted in current position and beats is sort of like, that's where I think if we explore what that does and how it does it, and it's not even necessarily in the code around it, it's in like, what do we expect frame count to be, and how does position and samples and frame count do have anything to do with anything. Like frame count is strictly a quantity, right? It's not a actual time. It's not a wall clock time. So if we're collecting a quantity every time that this function runs, but we're never checking what time it actually is, then we don't know. And this is just like, we're going to assume that this function gets called like at a consistent time, right? So that means that like we expect this function to be called every frame count number of frames, right? We expect it to happen like one after the other with nothing in between. And so how do we make sure that that assumption is true or false? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Like the
somewhat.
process function and the timing of it. Because that's
Yeah,
the system is going to call it.
This is on AudioKit 5. It has this current position in beats and position module. I think this is
Mhm.
going to be found somewhere inside of here as well.
Yeah.
See if it's,
I believe it's
you know,
right
it's
there in that.
exactly
Yeah.
the same.
Right.
So, but how does it at the end of the, like, I don't know that we're doing the same. Oh yeah, here it is. Actually, position and samples. There is this notion of UI position. I don't know what that is. What that really is. It's a way to get the position for like, you know, the position query most likely. So it's only used
Right.
to
It's just
for
updated.
that.
Right?
Yeah, yeah. So it's so
And
it
that's the
looks
thing, the frame
similar.
counts is the same too. Frame counted like continues to build that up over all calls, and position in samples gets reset when we stop. And frames counted actually represents all frames ever since any buffer ever got called. And then UI would also, UI basically goes like frames counted has every single one of them. Position in samples is modulo the loop time, and then UI is going to be a reflection of that.
So
same
how do we
thing.
use frames counted? We're just incrementing it
We
here.
don't. Yeah, it just happens to be there.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But see, what you see about all
Who
of
wrote
this is
this
like none
shit?
of it's tied to actual time.
Yeah. So
It's like
this is,
if you run it offline, then that time would be correct. The position in beats would definitely be correct, because in a offline rendering context, like it doesn't matter what time it really is when that function gets called, because you're just calling it all, you know, you're calling it like however many times you want. But if
fair enough,
sorry,
but
yeah.
it's didn't it's the same in both 4 and 5, right? But it works in
Right,
4. So that's
exactly.
really what I want to get to the
That's
heart of
why
this.
that's why I want to point that out, because that is it's sort of a red herring, because outside of this is the context within which these functions actually get triggered by the system. And it's the
Right.
guarantee of the timing and the time at which those get called that's going to define our drift over time. It's like the DSP one, the DSP kernel is going to get called more close to the actual wall clock time of the next buffer than the other. That's my hypothesis. I'm sorry if I keep badgering it, but it's like, that's where I think the problem is. So we have to time those things. We have to time like, when does this function gets called, the other one get called, and then look at how that beat position continues to reflect that time or not.
So the, maybe this is what you're saying as well, but just to say it
No,
again, is the only difference that we can really say is major between these two, now looking at the code deeper, is one is using the AU render observer block and the other one's not. Right, the other one's just using process.
I think so, yeah. I mean, you know, and that's, I'm just like, I think that's it, but I haven't, you know, if there's other differences, I don't know. It looks pretty similar.
Well, I mean, that's definitely where we got to look to.
So I ran a test.
Something that's testable, like, because tests run offline. So does that mean that we can't really test this?
I think we have to do some kind of like runtime stuff. So I did a thing where I threw into the process function on V5. I said, you know, what time is it now? And then I have two things. One is like get the current time, and I have the other one, which is like I set the current time to the last current time. So on the next buffer, I can get the difference between them. And then another piece of that is like, so we're basically saying like it gets called, it gets called, it gets called. How much time was there between these calls? And then to keep track of the start time, because like we can, with a start time and a buffer size, we can create a data set that represents every time that a perfectly non-drifting sequence, when it would trigger its one beat, right? And we can do that kind of like, we can say, okay, well, if we track the difference in time of these calls, we can see how much drift we're going to have over time, if that makes sense. So it's like start time and also difference of current call time to last call time. And those data. So then we have to run that like in an actual app doing it.
What bugs me is
Yeah.
that this is a problem that we didn't need to have in a way, right? The sequencer worked, and now it don't. And like I'm like, well,
right. That is
why
the,
did we
yeah.
change it to this? What did we get? What was the benefit of it? Did we get
Yeah.
out of this? And if this is just the way it works, is there an example code or something that
Mhm.
that shows us what we like, how we need to offset this, or how we need to repair what this other way of doing it has forced us to look into? Like,
Right.
I hate looking. I know that we've been like in the past we've had issues where the AudioKit metronome or the AudioKit sequencer was like way off, and then
Mhm.
Dave O'Neill came in and made it perfect, or he proved it was like as good as Logic on
Yeah.
his,
Yeah.
his
Oh, that's
top end
great.
stuff.
That's awesome.
And then we changed it. Now we're like back in like, I
Right.
wish there was a way to write a test for the future where we say like this can never be off because we have a test that will let us
Right.
know that someone did something they thought was beneficial for whatever reason, but
Mhm.
led us to drift, which I never want to see again, you know?
Yeah, totally. We could put, I mean, like, so what's happening is like the track is setting this observer function, and then it gets called by the system, and then the internal render block gets called by the system. If that's an issue, I don't even know, but we could just to do it, we could say, let's not set this process function as a render observer, but set it as a, an anonymous block over here. We could, whatever, you could do any number of things. You can make an atomic variable that just doesn't get set until it can be set, or you can put it on a, put the block on a very small FIFO that's real-time safe or whatever, so that whenever there's a new one, we just take the next one and we like use that to call, and we call that in the DSP kernel. So like instead of making a render observer that contributes events to that real-time event head list, because the DSP function processes that event, you know, but I'm not sure, I don't even know. It's like that's kind of the thing about it, is like the DSP kernel should be processing these events. We could just call that process function in the DSP kernel instead of making it into a render observer,
Right.
which is like, I don't even know if that's really the right way to go. I don't know, but we could just remove the render observer from the equation if we wanted to.
Yeah. And so I would say, AudioKit has a new position that just got filled called the sequence czar. And the sequence czar is actually with us today. It's Matt Howell. And this seems like a problem that I would like to dump on your lap if you would be so willing, because Brian's provided really good data on the
Yeah.
drift, and I can give you like, or I can probably make a Hey Metronome version that doesn't have like the closed source stuff to try to test against. So you have like an AudioKit 4 version that's actually working. Um,
Yeah.
Because I actually don't know where to look here. I think your ideas are good. Those are good ideas. But if you already know what to do, then I would rather just sit back and watch it be fixed.
No, totally. I feel that. I'm down to like take on the problem. I think I'll work with you, Brian, to just, stay together on like, oh, I'm trying this or that or whatever. But really the answer to this question is not going to, like, given that we don't have just like, oh, we know why or whatever right off the bat, like it's just going to come from us like clocking things and checking that time, those times and being like, what's the deal? Could be something completely just, whoa, that's weird. Why is that? I don't know. So
yeah, sequencer is a super important part of apps. And Brian has an app. I have an app that's sequencer based. It's been in development for like 2 years, and I now am going to have this problem as well. So I really want to get it fixed. Brian, you were going to say?
Yeah, I'm happy to help in any way I can. I'm not down at this level. I'm kind of at the high level use of the program, but of AudioKit, but I'm happy to help in any testing or whatever you want.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, you've already made so many great videos. Like those are awesome examples. Like here's the, it's so, yeah, it's super, you make it super obvious what's going on. And so we could keep working on it together.
Yeah, great. Happy to help.
Yeah. Yeah, I look at these problems like kind of anything related to, you know, whether it's the multi-thread stuff or whether it's like timing issues of like, we have this thing that has to happen in time. Like, you know, we need to schedule that it happens in time. We need to schedule that it happens in time on time. That's like, those are the classic problems that I think are going to come up when you're playing with this sort of like buffer based scenario. It's like everything is done by that frame count or like number of samples. It's like,
Right.
you gotta time everything. So it's fun.
And this
I
will
look at it
also,
like, yeah,
by the way, guys, this will keep AudioKit 5 in beta. This won't, AudioKit 5 won't come out of beta if the sequencer is still drifting. I'm definitely gonna wait on that. A couple other things that just kind of office keeping stuff I wanted to mention is that, so this week I got rid of Easy Audio from AudioKit, and I got rid of the TP circular buffer. So because now we've seen a couple of ways to do things in better ways from Taylor. So now I figure, well, why have more code that has to get compiled inside of AudioKit for everybody? So those things are gone. Matt Pfeiffer, who's here for the first couple of office hours, he wrote a bunch of visualization things. So it helped us get rid of Easy Audio's visualization stuff. And so
nice.
so this office hour stuff is actually paying off. Like people are making contributions that they're making AudioKit leaner and better and stuff. So it's been pretty cool. Yeah, so I definitely, I think by next week we'll have this solved one way or another. I'm not just dumping it on your plate, Matt. I want to work on it as well.
I'm super interested in it.
yeah.
I'm like, I showed up in the right slot for these things. So hopefully, yeah. And I'm open to anyone, whoever's interested in it, just like, you know, blabbing at me and telling me what I may or may not do right or wrong and what I have done right or wrong. So just so you know.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting if we find out a render observer is somehow patchable, or if it's something we should avoid using for whatever reason, if it's not intended for things that have to remain sample accurate for long periods of time.
Yeah.
So
yeah. I want these things to be like easy for people to understand, because it's like the one missing thing from Apple documentation. They just don't really tell you stuff. And it's like, okay, you know, like I feel like I've spent like a year and a half now, up until around now, where I've been like clawing into every dark place where I could find on the internet. I'm just like, where the hell is the information about this stuff? And so this is just part of that to me. I'm like, I want this stuff to be clear for people later too. Like if they see this is an example of something working a certain way or not working a certain way. It's like people should just be able to see that stuff. Like this shouldn't be just like
one of the odd things
problem
about the internet I've noticed with this particular realm is like normally you would kind of expect the world to get better, like the internet, the information retrieval to get better. Somebody would like organize things, but we've had several like incidents where like Apple took down their documentation, like erased it from their own internal stuff. Like we couldn't have access to it more. People didn't have it. Some people had it like stored elsewhere. So you end up finding documentation like Xamarin, like these cross-platform things that like took snapshots of iOS at some point.
Right.
And it's like the day you're getting like worse and worse feedback about what the documentation isn't getting better over time. It's actually getting harder to find and harder to make sense of. So if we can have a system that's like usable and documented, unfortunately, like I think I'm gonna have to, get back into like documentation mode once AudioKit 5 is out, because it's such a huge part of this too. So it's an unfortunate world in some ways for the audio programmers. We have to apply our heads to the wall a lot of times to get things done.
I've been trying to keep track, I have like copious notes now. I use Notion and it's been really nice to use, but like, it's like a note taking app. And like, I have notes on the drift and the jitter. I have notes on like, pulses per quarter note, things I've figured out, like aspects of MIDI just for sequencing, like note ordering, and then also just general keeping track of like, okay, this is how we're testing the sequencer. This is how I'm modifying the sequencer. Hopefully I could provide some, like a few maybe like markdown documents that just kind of say, oh, hey, I noticed you looking at the code for the sequencer. Like, here's the info we have about sequencing and about Apple and whatever. That's kind
Aside
of
from
one of my goals.
Xcode starting to barf over Markdown, there's a lot of Markdown inside of AudioKit.
Right.
So hopefully they fix that soon, so there's not so many warnings when you build AudioKit. But
Yeah,
I really
that's
did
crazy.
want to have every folder at least to have a
Mhm.
Markdown file in it that
That's awesome.
kind of it looks nice in GitHub. First of all, if you go to that folder and you get
Totally.
something, but it's tough because those documentation that's separate from the code does get out of date.
Right.
Even
Right.
because documentation inside of code goes out of date, so it's
Yeah,
tough.
and that can get noisy and sort of dirty too. It's like really hard to balance all that. I get it. Yeah. We'll do the best we
Yeah.
can. Sounds awesome.
But I think I want to try to come back next week office hours, and hopefully have like some good news on this front for you, Brian.
That's
That
cool.
would be awesome.
Thanks very much, guys. I really appreciate all the help. Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, you started, as like I always tell people who are writing GitHub issues, is if they write a good issue and they actually give me like a project I can compile and try, it's like showing the error that the likelihood of me fixing something is 10,000 fold than if you just describe it, because I have to build my own project and like it just takes too much work. But seeing videos of the thing in action and being here to explain it as well is that's why it's getting worked on basically. Somebody just
I have
said
a question.
sequencer no good, I would have totally ignored them, right? So,
I have a question about V5, and it's in like sort of like making apps and also making AUV3 plugin extensions or whatever. Like, where is that? Are we there, or how is that working like right now? What do you know about that? What do you guys know?
we're there.
Okay, cool.
Documentation wise, we're not.
Okay.
But I have been working on stuff with Matt and Jeff and Marcus and stuff where
Awesome.
basically we take that point of view that we want AUV3 to be a first class citizen. We're not going to build the app and then tag on AUV3, which is kind of how it was done in the past, because they introduced
Awesome.
AUV3 and we had to add it on to our apps that were already created.
I
But
see.
AudioKit 5 is sort of, it plays by the rules that Apple wants you to play by more than AudioKit 4 did. So it's a lot more straightforward, and it's going to work without any kind of hacks to let your app be AUV3. And I mentioned a couple office hours ago that I think that it might be a reasonable way of looking at things to build your AUV3 as the primary place for your conductor and stuff like that, to make sure it works in that environment, and even let your app be a sort of a thin host for that AUV3.
Sweet. Oh, that's rad. That's great. I love it.
But yeah, I'm sort of like, where do I want to spend my time? Like if I document this or I make these examples, it takes time from projects that,
Yeah.
we could release for money and stuff like that. So you gotta always balance like what you're doing for the open source and what you're trying to build to support yourself. So yeah.
Right, exactly. That's awesome. Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm interested in that piece too, so I would be down to make some examples. Super.
Cool. All right. Well, I think we did an hour. It was kind of scattered, but I think we finally got down to some actual specific stuff about the sequencer to take a look at this next week. So I appreciate everybody.
Yeah.
I'll see you guys soon. I'll probably see a
Sweet.
couple of you on Slack like right now. So talk to you in a bit.
Awesome. Thanks
All
a
right.
lot.
See you guys.
See you guys.
Bye.
Great seeing you guys.